With every long-running game franchise, there tends to be at least one entry that splits the fan base down the middle. I have also noticed that one of the primary reasons for that split tends to be an experimentation with the pre-established gameplay formula. Maybe it's the introduction of the flood system in Super Mario Sunshine, or changing Banjo-Kazooie from a platformer into a game about vehicles with nuts and bolts. When stuff like this happens, many fans will view these changes as either positive and progressive, or think they violate what made the original game special. One thing that happens quite often when I've played these types of games is that I find myself bewildered by certain arguments in favor or against them. Though I am usually able to understand why fans like or dislike something in a game, regardless of my personal agreement, there are always a couple of instances where I just don't get it. Naturally, I expected something similar to happen a few months ago, when I finally got to play what a lot of people consider the most experimental of the Final Fantasy games, Final Fantasy VIII. For many years, my fellow Final Fantasy fans conditioned me to believe that FF8 fell into this same category of game, and now that I've played it, I can say that I believe it does. However, there is one thing about it that makes it stand out amongst other games of its ilk, at least for me. Unlike those other games, I can easily understand every argument made in favor and against this game. I understand why people love this game enough to make it their favorite in the series, but I can also understand why people loathe it to the point that it's one of their most disliked. I will set things up by giving my general opinion of Final Fantasy VIII. I personally think that it is a great game, and part of why I think that is because I believe all of the experimental ideas at the root of Final Fantasy VIII are genius. But I must admit, the execution of each of those ideas will vary depending on your tastes. I will use the game's infamous junction system as an example. Out of all the combat systems in all the FF games I've played thus far, the junction system is my second favorite, just behind Final Fantasy X's. I love it because it allows for greater freedom in the way I approach combat encounters, and makes it so that I don't have to grind the levels of individual party members. That said, the junction system's effectiveness does depend on your willingness to continuously draw magic from enemies in order to junction/boost your stats. Now, you might be fine with this, like I am, or you might view it as a tedious elongation of the battles, and I have no argument against that. The most pertinent place that this pattern carries over to, however, is the game's story, which is such a shame because I'm of the belief that what FF8's story is trying to do is not just some of the most brilliant stuff that I've ever encountered in a Final Fantasy game, but any game. Though FF8's core theme of fate and predestination is familiar to the Final Fantasy franchise, it goes against the grain by making fate something that you shouldn't struggle against, but instead enthusiastically accept. Though some might say struggling against fate enables freedom and exalts the human will, Final Fantasy VIII counters by suggesting that fate will bring us to the people and the moments that complete us. After all, we can't get through all of life's trials alone, just by our strength of will. Maybe we need the right people at the right times to help carry us through life's greatest challenges. Unfortunately, much of the beauty of this message can get overshadowed at times by questionable creative decisions, which, again, I have a very hard time arguing against. Nonetheless, I wish to spend the rest of the video elucidating and celebrating the beauty of those core concepts, while also acknowledging how and why it was lost on some people who played this game. Before I do, I will note that there are spoilers ahead for the entirety of Final Fantasy VIII. If you have never played the game and wish to do so before hearing my analysis, please bookmark this video and come back to it when you're done. I will start by focusing in on the character that is most relevant to this theme of fate, Squall. Like the game itself, opinion towards Squall also seems to be split into camps of love and hate. For much of my time with the game, I must admit, I didn't like Squall whatsoever, and I couldn't understand why the characters or other fans would like him either. Granted, my feelings about his character arc did become more positive towards the end of the game, when his friends enabled him to be more emotionally vulnerable. Yet I still had a hard time understanding how people would justify some of his behavior. Things like, why wouldn't Squall shake Zell's hand when it was presented? Or why wouldn't he give Rinoa a hug when she asked? Like, who? Who wouldn't do that? Despite my bewilderment, I did try to read as many arguments in favor of the character that I could online, and upon doing so, I found a lot of really interesting explanations regarding why Squall acts the way he does. First, I will address Squall's trademark "whatever" line. This is probably the primary thing that prevented me from ever fully warming up to Squall at first. He says whatever so often and with such seeming rudeness, to the point that every time it was uttered, any positive sentiment I might have had was instantly drained from my mind. But when I was doing research into the game, I came across this article from legendsoflocalization.com, which was entirely dedicated to why Squall says whatever so much. Apparently, in the original Japanese, Squall was saying many different things depending on the situation, and often they are a lot less offensive and much more understandable. For instance, Squall's teacher Quistis, who has an obvious and somewhat inappropriate crush on him, notes that he has no problem dancing with random strangers but has a hard time being around her. To which Squall supposedly responds with a rude, "whatever." But in the original Japanese, what he actually says is closer to a plain, "my bad," or "sorry," which are much more acceptable responses in my opinion. This trend continues for multiple other instances. Sometimes the translation is accurate, but most other times, phrases like, "I can't believe this teacher," or "oh geez," or "well excuse me," are all translated to the same "whatever." Not only does knowing this make Squall seem like much less of a jerk, it actually makes him more entertaining. Because now whenever I hear Rinoa scold Squall, I just think about this.
Squall, you should really stop acting so callous towards your comrades.
Well, excuse me for having enormous flaws that I don't work on!
So much better. Unfortunately though, the effect of these whatevers can be enough to lead someone to believe that he really is just a jerk, which is a sentiment that can become compounded when you make dialogue choices. If you believe that Squall is a jerk, you might be compelled to choose all of the dialogue options that are in line with that belief. When that happens, it can become even harder to understand not only why certain gamers like him, but why the people in Squall's party like him. I strongly believe that if the translations were more accurate and the dialogue options were either modified or removed entirely, then the fanbase's sentiment towards him wouldn't be anywhere near as split as it seems to be. For myself, having context for those whatevers and choosing nicer dialogue made a lot of Squall's initial coldness not only digestible, but understandable. Suddenly, Squall's refusal to shake hands with somebody or give somebody a hug seemed less like the actions of somebody who's being an inconsiderate jerk, and more like the behavior of somebody who has completely closed off their emotions due to past trauma. Granted, the story does explain this later on, when we learn that Squall was an orphan that was abandoned by everybody he loved, but still, I wasn't able to comprehend that on an intuitive level. After all, I've known people who have suffered past emotional trauma of a similar ilk and were closed off, but didn't act as offensively as Squall did. But now, I not only understand, I empathize. As somebody who grew up with undiagnosed autism, I often said and did things that I later learned were very off-putting to people, which in turn caused me to become more emotionally reserved. In the end, I found myself not only identifying with Squall more than any other Final Fantasy protagonist up until this point, but also with the journey he goes through to overcome that trauma. And as I said before, the solution to that trauma is to embrace one's fate. The theme of fate is very common in Final Fantasy games. Some games, like the most recent Final Fantasy XVI, suggest fate is something that should be eschewed in favor of developing a strong sense of free will. Others, like my personal favorite, Final Fantasy IX, suggest fate is something we should learn to accept. 8, however, strongly argues that we shouldn't just accept fate, but embrace it wholeheartedly. Now, in order to understand why that is the correct option, at least in the reality of Final Fantasy VIII, it would be beneficial for us to quickly review some of the game's complicated lore. As we learn at the beginning, Squall is a member of a mercenary force known as SEED. Their services are not bound by country or ideology, but will be lent out to any government or civilian that requests them. In other words, SEED is like Outer Heaven in Metal Gear if it were a high school, which, can you imagine if that were real? I can't tell if that would be awesome or the most terrifying thing ever. Anyway, SEED does have a greater purpose beyond mere mercenary work, one that isn't revealed until you are well into the game. We eventually learn that SEED was set up by a man named Sid and a woman named Edea, the same woman who just so happened to be Squall's caretaker at the orphanage he grew up in. And yes, I am getting to that reveal, don't you worry. Long before Squall was a SEED, Sid and Edea garnered intel that a sorceress from the future named Ultimisia would one day cast a spell known as time compression. This spell would compress the past, present, and future into a single moment, which would then enable the sorceress to remake reality according to her evil will. In response to this, Sid and Edea created SEED in order to gather a strong enough group of mercenaries to battle Ultimisia when this spell was cast. As for how this intel was gathered, that is something we do not find out until the end of the game. After Ultimisia casted time compression, Squall and his team traveled to that compressed moment in time to battle her. After they defeated her, they were all cast out into a boundless, timeless void. On their journey back to their restructured reality, Squall and Ultimisia find themselves in the past, specifically at the orphanage that Squall grew up in. Ultimisia passes her powers onto Edea before she dies, and Squall explains who Ultimisia was and what Edea must do in order to stop her future plans. And this is how Edea learned of Ultimisia's existence and got the idea for SEED in the first place. Now, I imagine that a lot of people, if they were in Edea's shoes, would not accept this as their fate. They would not take on the massive responsibility of building up an expensive, world-class military over the course of 13 years to try and stop Ultimisia's scheme. Instead, they would attempt any other method just to avoid that responsibility, that fate. This is precisely what characters like Elena and Dr. Odine are trying to do when they send people's consciousnesses into the past, hoping that it will affect the present and the future by proxy. The same is presumably true for Ultimisia, who is likely trying to remake reality either to avoid a particular fate or to spite fate, which would be consistent with the motives of many other Final Fantasy villains. But as they all find out after numerous attempts, nothing can change the past, and nothing can change the future from continuing down its predetermined course. Nonetheless, the burden of living up to this responsibility is still so great that these and other characters will continue to struggle against it however they can, even though that just makes the journey to their destiny all the more painful. The one character who did embrace fate, however, despite the unconscionable responsibility that it conferred, was Edea. In doing so, she lived arguably a more noble and meaningful life than anybody. She served as a mother figure to many orphans that needed one. She built up Seed alongside her husband Sid, and she even shielded the future Seeds in her care from knowing the painful truth that their lives were fated to a particular outcome, especially, though not limited to, Squall. Now, before I finally bring things back around to Squall's fate, I must acknowledge that the things I've praised thus far are largely subtextual. In contrast, some of the ways that FF8 sets up how fate works in this world, and the struggle with it, does tend to vary in quality. I will cite what is probably the most contentious example of this, one that I briefly hinted at earlier. It has to do with Edea's role as both a matron to the orphans, as well as the primary villain for a huge chunk of the game. For the first half of the game, we are told that Edea is the evil sorceress that Seed needs to stop. Then around the game's midpoint, the character Irvine helps everybody in the party remember that they all grew up in the same orphanage, and were all looked after by Edea. The only reason they all forgot is because they are all suffering memory loss on account of using summons. A fact that is only alluded to if you pay close attention to a document that you can easily skip over at the beginning of the game. When you first play FF8, these revelations feel like they come out of absolute nowhere, like it was a plot thread slapped in at the last second. Now, I might have forgiven it if maybe this led to the characters contending with the emotional repercussions of memory manipulation, a la Final Fantasy IX, or if they at least expressed some hesitation about killing the woman who raised them. That would have helped amplify the central theme of contending with fate extremely well. But unfortunately, those potential avenues are left completely unexplored. There are other examples of this, which I will get to in a moment, but I want to turn the focus back to Squall, because his journey reflects the theme of fate very well. Naturally, because Edea learned from adult Squall that he is integral to Ultimicia's defeat, she makes sure his life path goes down the right direction, so that he will become a great leader one day and defeat Ultimisia. However, she does not let him find out that he has a destiny, and that his life is being orchestrated towards it. If he did, I imagine he would react much in the same way that characters like Elena, Odine, and Ultimisia did. He would try everything he can to avoid that fate, instead of embracing the responsibility that comes with it and allowing it to turn him into a better person. Instead, Edea figured it would be better if he didn't know and figure out for himself why this fate is good for him. Though, this isn't without its struggle either. As we plainly see throughout the game, Squall detests the idea of becoming a leader. The notion that people could depend on him, and that he could potentially fail them, threatens to demolish the emotional defense mechanisms he has built up all his life. Though it kept him closed off from everybody, at least it kept him relatively emotionally stable. Of course, as the game goes along, this state of affairs becomes increasingly impossible, as his inner sense of goodness and justice calls him to his fate. Most importantly, his relationships with his comrades allow him to realize that this personal ethic of detachment is unsustainable. Up until this point, it has been understandable. He was orphaned at a young age, and was separated from his sister figure, Elena, while at the orphanage. After that, he surmised that it would be better to not get attached to anybody again, so that way he would not have to go through the pain of losing them like he lost his parents and Elena in his youth. However, this approach does not solve the underlying problem. What does is allowing yourself to get close to others so their love and support can help you overcome that trauma. And even if you do end up losing them, the love you shared would help you overcome that loss. Though Squall's friends helped in this regard, he could only come around to that truth by a fateful encounter with somebody who truly completed him. His other half, his soulmate, Rinoa. Now, before I conclude with an analysis of Rinoa and Squall's relationship, I must reinvoke my central thesis. Like all of Final Fantasy VIII's core concepts, I believe that Rinoa's role in helping Squall overcome his past trauma is both brilliant and terribly romantic. But the ways in which that concept is executed vary. Like I said before about dialogue choices, if you respond coldly to Rinoa all the time, it can be very difficult to understand why the hell she likes him. Plus, there are some instances where the writers of the game thought it would be a good time for Rinoa and Squall to flirt when the circumstances are completely inappropriate, like when the battle against the forces of Galbadia is happening. Rinoa and Squall run away from the fight, only for her to stop him and start admiring Squall for his strength and pride, which would be perfectly fine and very beneficial for Squall's character arc, if, there weren't people dying in the thousands right behind you! Beyond this stuff, though, I did find that Rinoa and Squall's burgeoning relationship felt organic and believable. Now, there are a couple of other circumstances where I have noticed fans have expressed disbelief in the way Rinoa and Squall act towards each other. For instance, there's a moment after the battle against Galbadia when Rinoa falls into a coma, after Ultimisia, acting through Edea, transferred her powers to Rinoa. Squall then kneels beside her bed and begs for her to wake up, which some people thought was an enormous shift between the way Squall had been acting towards Rinoa up until that point. Though this is true, I also know that people don't tend to truly realize what they have until they lose it or risk losing it. Now that Squall risks losing Rinoa, his attitude turns on a dime, and he starts to realize the positive impact that she has had on his life. Even though he knows this attachment will probably bring him greater pain, he starts to realize, as I said before, that he can endure that pain if he allows their love to bloom. Suddenly, the idea of fate doesn't seem like a restriction or a burden. In this case, fate brought Squall to his true love, and that love would help him overcome anything. Not just his trauma, but maybe even including the very fabric of reality. With that notion in mind, I would like to offer my interpretation of the game's ending. It may or may not be true, but nonetheless, I believe it accentuates what the game is trying to say regarding why fate should be embraced. After defeating Ultimisia and informing Edea about what is to come, Squall is temporarily cast into a dark void of nothingness. Per the instruction of the character Laguna, he must think about Rinoa and his connection with her in order to escape the void and return to reality. I like to think that in this void of nothingness, the constrictions of fate no longer apply. Though this would grant Squall the freedom from fate that he craved for the majority of the game, it is literally and symbolically empty. Worse, Squall risks dying in this void if he doesn't heed Laguna's words. Though he tries to use his newfound free will to bring himself back to Rinoa, his multiple attempts fail, and his consciousness starts to fade. It is only when Rinoa thinks about her connection to Squall that their combined efforts allow them to find each other and return to reality. This therefore proves that love can not only defy the boundaries of space and time, but fate. In other words, it was not fate, but an act of will on both of their parts that brought them back together. But most importantly, and somewhat paradoxically, they used their free will to embrace fate. A fate that was written in the stars from time immemorial. Squall and Rinoa were always fated to be with one another, because if they weren't, neither of them would ever be complete.